World Regions Geography 110, Lecture 2, Part 3. So we're continuing with that reintegration. We talked about the cheap land and labor has brought in a lot of foreign direct investment. It has also led to inflation, unemployment, homelessness appeared quickly right after the fall, and then you have gradually these countries in Eastern Europe are struggling. You have a lot of laborers from Eastern Europe working in Western Europe. You may have heard of Brexit, which is the British exit from the EU, just voted on and passed in Britain. It still remains to be seen whether they'll actually exit the EU. But part of the problem was this free access of labor, because once you're in the EU, you can travel anywhere between the various countries without a passport and without any controls. So people in England didn't like having a lot of foreign workers coming in and working for lower prices. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Countries are well integrated. So one of the things that happens in Europe is that you can travel between countries relatively easily without any problem. There are some issues revolved around enforcing laws in various countries. Even though they have agreements to enforce it, it doesn't always work out that way in the real world. I did some research over in Germany, southern Germany, and one of the German Bundespolice, which is the state police who monitor the border with France, said the problem that they faced was that thieves would come from France into Germany, steal cars, take them back to France, and the French authorities would refuse to prosecute them or even confiscate the vehicles because they said they weren't stolen in France. So it's not all as easy to as they try to say it is. So now the economy, accumulation, production of inequality. So the European Union accounts for 35% of the world's exports and 33% of the world's aggregate gross national income. Welfare states are something that you hear a lot of talk about in U.S. politics and even in German and European politics, France and Germany, Great Britain. People say one side's better, one side's worse. Social housing. People have a guarantee in the EU of housing. If states fail to provide housing for all the citizens, then they can actually be sued by the people who are homeless. So, you know, there's some good and some bad in there. The EU has a common agricultural policy, so that means the same rules apply everywhere here in terms of the chemicals that you can use, how things are grown, what you can include in your a lot of additives, things like that they don't allow that we have. And the Maastricht Treaty, this has to do with the currency, the euro. It was in 1992, which led to the creation of the common European currency, which we call the euro. And it was basically what they had set up to be able to have a common currency. Up until that time, you had Deutschmarks in Germany, you had francs, you had lira, you had drachma in Greece. So all the currencies in all the countries were different, which inhibited trading. So by having one currency throughout the EU, with the exception of Great Britain, they were much easier to trade goods back and forth because the currency was the same no matter where you were. Territory and politics. So the Age of Enlightenment, that's the rise of the nation state. So in other words, in 18th, 19th century, you have this age of enlightenment. You have a lot of writers, particularly here in France, England, that talked about the rights of man, freedom, democracy. Even though they were kingdoms, they still talked about all of these rights. And that gave the rise to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, um, the consolidation of Germany. There was the Holy Roman Empire, and all these small little countries, city-states, duchies, small kingdoms in what is now Germany, and that wasn't reunited until the late 19th century. Regionalism, very big. Ethnic minorities, whether they were Jews or Slavs or Gypsies, were discriminated against. Violence and political autonomy. Irredentism, that is that belief that the population outside of a nation's borders belong to that country. So there was a lot of Germans that had traveled east into the Ukraine, into Poland, and into Russia. And that was one of the reasons why Hitler tried to create the Greater Reich, and he tried to move into these areas to rescue these ethnic Germans from the Slavs that control those areas. Ethnic conflict, Balkanization, you may have heard of that term. It is about this region. And after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, England and France and the Allies carved these up into countries. These countries were typical colonial creations of nation states that did not recognize ethnic differences, did not recognize religious differences, cultural differences, and this led to some, once the Soviet Union collapsed and once Eastern European powers collapsed, you began this 10-year, 15-year long conflict for these ethnic groups to break up these larger nation states into individual ethnic countries, whether they're Serbs or they're Croats, Albanians, Macedonians, and this ethnic cleansing, which is where one group would wipe out the other group. Kosovo is the big example of that, but you have the same thing going on in the Middle East right now, and for the very same reason. It's post-colonial fallout. It's the Europeans after World War I, after the collapse of the Ottomans. They went into the Middle East. They created all these nation states that disregarded ethnic divisions and historical homelands, and that has created a situation that is the Middle East is going through exactly what the Balkans did. The cultures and populations, some major religions. Roman Catholic, obviously, centered in Rome. At one time, all of Europe was Catholic. Then you had the Protestant Reformation, mostly Northern Europe, England, Scandinavia. Those regions became Protestant. The southern regions remained pretty much Catholic. Immigrants and Islam. So you had people moving from the East. You have people moving from Africa, from the Middle East, from various territories controlled by the various empires, and with them brought new religions, including Islam. And you have the rise of secularism, which is a separation of government and religion. Up until that rise of secularism, which was a real conflict and really kind of a 18th, 19th century change, late 18th, early 19th century into the 20th century, and increasing secularism in Europe. And now you're kind of seeing a, maybe not so much a rise, reemergence of religion, but a reemergence of ethnic um, discrimination, maybe in Europe, in response to large African and particularly Islamic migration into Europe. I think you're going to see some more serious conflicts. You're having a rise in right-wing political groups. You're going to see some ethnic conflict in Europe over the coming decades. Languages, you have a Romance language, which is this region here. So your Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, all of these are Romance, and Romanian. It's kind of stuck out here by itself, but it's actually Romance language, very similar to Latin. Germanic, English, Irish, Germany, of course. This region up here, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, pretty much here in the east. Baltic and unique group here. Non-Indo-European, Estonian and Finnish, Lapps up here. You have Thracian and Cyrillic, so these are fairly ancient. If you read any Greek history, you'll read about Thrace and Ilium. This area right in here, Macedon, that area. Hellenic is your Greek. So very different language, number of large language groups in Europe. Cultural practices, social differences, identity, modernity is that concept of a unilateral direction and unilateral process for a country becoming modernized. European identity, you're seeing a rise in this European identity as exhibited by the changes in immigration laws, xenophobia, this rising distrust of outsiders, and I think you're seeing this a lot with Islam and Muslims in general moving into Europe. The role of women in European society, gender inequality, income gaps with women, important. European is a leader in increasing equality for women, and but you don't have the same protections that you do in the U.S.